Hello, everybody. I just wanted to have a quick chit chat about the latest Supreme Court decision to allow federal executions to continue here in the United States. So recently, the Supreme Court ruled that it was okay to proceed with federal executions. There was a halt on federal executions starting from 2014 under President Obama, when there was a botched execution due to the drug that they used to conduct the executions called pentobarbital. So in 2014, President Barack Obama had requested for the Justice Department to conduct a review on whether or not federal executions were considered cruel and unusual. So after several court cases and hearings and whatever goes on with the Supreme Court, they did rule that it was okay to proceed with federal executions. The first person to be executed since then was Daniel, let me get his name correct, Daniel Lewis Lee. He was executed about a week or two ago, the first person to be executed since the ruling was made. And he was considered to be a white supremacist who, along with an accomplice, had murdered an entire family. It was a family of three. It was the mother, the father, and their 8-year-old daughter. Now, this was back in 1990. Mr. Lee and his accomplice had wanted to start an all-white nation along with whatever white supremacist group that they were associated with. And so they murdered this family for their ammunition and $50,000 in cash that they were going to use to begin their all-white nation. So the murders of these people was extremely brutal. They had somehow incapacitated them. I think they had used taser guns on them. They wrapped their bodies in plastic bags, or their heads at least, in plastic bags. They tied stones to them, and then they dumped their live bodies in the water, and this family drowned. And so throughout his stay in prison and even up until his death, he had maintained his innocence, claiming that he was not a murderer. His last words before his execution was that he was not a murderer and that he was innocent of these crimes. The second person to be executed since the law was set in motion again was Wesley Purkey. He was in federal prison for the murder of a 16-year-old girl, which he had kidnapped, murdered, dismembered her body, and then dumped her body. Let me go back and say that again. He kidnapped, murdered, dismembered her body, burnt her body, and then dumped her ashes in a septic pond. At the same time, he was also in prison for the murder of an 80-year-old woman who was stricken with polio. So he killed a child, he killed an elderly woman, two victims who had no way of defending themselves. And so justly, he was convicted of these crimes. For the 80-year-old woman, he got life in prison. For the 16-year-old girl, he received the death penalty. Now, his attorneys had argued throughout the years that he was mentally incompetent to be executed. His competency was also at issue at or before the actual criminal trial, whether or not he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. It was ruled that he was. And then since then, his attorneys had argued that he was mentally incompetent to be executed. Now, I think that is a bar to execution if you are deemed to be mentally incompetent, because you have to know the reason why you're being executed. You have to have full understanding of why you're being executed. His lawyers had argued that during the latter years of his life, he was afflicted with dementia. They also argued that his mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was extremely forgetful, forgetting important dates, important events. But at the end of it all, they ruled that he was mentally incompetent and he was executed. Now, my issue of the death penalty on the federal level or even on the state level is that because our justice system is so flawed and there are cases upon cases upon cases of people who have been wrongfully convicted, I sometimes wonder if there have been people who have been wrongfully executed. This we know is true before this, well, who knows up until when, but we know for a fact that this is true with the execution of several minorities back in I don't know how far back you want to go, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, where there have been cases where I don't even want to say it seemed like, where there have been cases where people were executed simply because of their race. The evidence had nothing to do with anything. Now, since then, we can only hope and pray that race, gender, sexual orientation, economic status have had no bearing on whether someone is convicted of their crimes and whether or not someone is executed. I say that a bit flippantly, but it's one thing to convict someone of a crime that they may not be guilty of, and it's something else completely when a government entity takes the life of someone who possibly may be innocent. Now, with the two people that I mentioned, Daniel Lewis Lee and Wesley Purkey, I'm not by any means saying that these people were innocent. From what I read, there was no question of their guilt. My issue is that in some cases, there may be an issue of whether or not an innocent person is being executed. And because it's been proven time and time again in our history that our justice system is flawed, I don't see why the government, federal and state governments, I don't see why they would not stop executions, because we don't really know in a lot of cases. We don't really know whether this punishment really fits the crime, if there was a crime committed at all. If we can prove that there's been if there's been 100-year study or 150-year study where every single person that was executed was rightfully executed, that they were proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they were guilty of these crimes, fine. But because it's been proven that even on the level of convictions, that some of these convictions are terribly flawed, justice is not meted out fairly, that a lot of factors come into play when people are convicted. Could those same factors be into play when people are executed? That's my only question. Some may even argue that besides the issue of whether or not we are killing innocent people, just the whole idea of a civilized nation, a first world country, such as the United States, whether or not the government is really in a position to take people's lives. People will always kill each other. But you would think that a government entity is somewhat intellectually elevated than the average person. And is this something that really needs to continue in a civilized nation? Some people might say yes, and some people might say no. But my whole problem with the death penalty is whether or not it's being carried out with 100% fairness. The things that these two particular individuals did to their victims is absolutely horrific. It's worse than any nightmare you can imagine. And I believe that they did what they did. And if this is the punishment of this land, then this is the punishment that they deserved. I'm just questioning whether in every instance it is dealt with fairly, that these death penalties, these executions are done completely fairly, completely just, without a shadow of a doubt that the person that the government is killing is truly guilty of these crimes. If that is guaranteed, if that is confirmed, which in some cases we will never know, then fine. It is what it is. It's the law of the land. But if there's been a history of unfairness, discrimination, prejudices that resulted in innocent people being convicted and possibly innocent people being executed, then we need to put a halt based on that alone. And then, of course, there's a whole argument of whether or not it's cruel and unusual. I've never really understood that argument of whether or not the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment based on how it's carried out. For example, some people will argue, well, because when these drugs are administered, there's been cases where the prisoner has felt pain or it didn't work the first time, so they had to administer the drugs again. Because to me, if you're going to argue cruel and unusual punishment, I think just the act of killing someone is cruel and unusual. It's cruel and unusual when the defendant did it to their victim. And why is it any less than when the government does it to the defendant? And I know the argument of, if, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, if you kill someone, you don't deserve to live among civilized people. You've given up your right to live among us because you're a threat to everybody. So we need to get rid of you. And I think one of the issues that makes that argument stronger is because the prisons have been, now this is my assumption and from the things that I've read and things that I've seen, I don't know for a fact. I've never been to prison. I don't know anyone who has been to prison. But what makes the argument for execution stronger is that these people who are convicted, they're truly guilty, they have done such horrific, evil things to their victims that life in prison doesn't seem good enough. It doesn't seem like the victim really justice was really served for the victim, because of the fact that, this person goes to prison. Yes, they have certain rights taken away from them. They definitely have their freedom taken away from them. But evidently, life in prison is not exactly torturous. Now, what the prisoners do to each other might be torturous, but the prison system itself provides them with meals, education, skills, a place to sleep, safety to a certain point. And so some people are like, okay, you go out and you harm people, you inflict pain on people, you kill people, and then you go to this, less than glorified motel, basically. You hang out with your friends, your homies, you playing cards, you're watching TV. Some of them have access to cell phones. You're taking drugs, you're smoking cigarettes, and so people are like, how is this any fair? And so it seems like the only thing that can be fair and that can be just is by taking their life when they've taken the life of another. Now, so many people go to prison for years and then they're released for murder. They're convicted of murder. They go and serve their time and then they're back out. And of course, you have to have committed a certain level of a murder in order to warrant the death penalty. Now, if you were in a bar fight and you punch somebody out and they hit their head on the concrete and they die, yes, maybe you're not someone who's just out there killing innocent people. You're involved in some kind of a altercation with someone, and you can argue self-defense. But for the people that are just randomly picking people, or people who are just killing the most innocent of our society, no, you can't do 10 years and then come out. But then doing life in prison doesn't seem enough. And so I get the point of arguing, for the death penalty in that situation. My only issue with the death penalty is that, can we ever be guaranteed that it is administered fairly, that it's not, that things such as race and gender and economic status do not have anything to do with the decision that was made by the jury or by the judge to convict this person? Because if a person of this race kills 20 people, they get the death penalty, but the person of that race killed 20 people and they just got life in prison. You know, what's really going on here? So if it can be administered, that's the word I was looking for. If it can be administered 100% fairly and just, I understand the argument for it. But if there is no guarantee of that, then maybe there should be an end to the death penalty, not because of any kind of sympathy for the prisoner, but because it's not administered fairly. And it's not administered fairly, number one. And are we truly killing people who are guilty of these crimes? There have been movies and documentaries made of people who could have been innocent that were executed. And if that is going on, what is wrong with halting them temporarily? Well, not even temporarily, halting them permanently. But then the flip side of that is, for the people who are truly guilty of the most heinous of crimes, killing the most innocent of people, then what happens to them? Because we've already determined in this country, the Supreme Court has already ruled that you can't let prisoners live in harsh conditions, you know, where you're giving them just bread and water, where you're whipping them every day, where, you know, they're living in subpar conditions. The Supreme Court has already ruled that people can't live in those types of conditions while they're in prison, that they're entitled to have certain freedoms and certain rights, you know, which I think the majority of us just don't understand. You know, you're out here in society terrorizing everybody, but when you go to prison, you know, you get cable, you play cards, you hang out with your friends, you do whatever you want, you have certain privileges that just is like, your victim is dead. Your victim is 6 feet under, but you're kind of like going about life laughing and talking and, you know, living it up. Now, I'm not saying that it's luxurious, but it's not the worst place on earth. You can probably think of about 1,000 things worse than living in American prison. Sometimes the jails are worse than the prisons. So it's just food for thought. You know, I just wanted to come up here and give my 2 cents about executions in general, whether it's on the state level or federal level. But these 2 cases prompted me to want to come talk about my thoughts and opinions on the death penalty. Like I said, it's not because I'm sympathetic to the killer. I'm not. I just want to make sure that it's administered completely fairly, that gender and race and economic status have nothing to do with the decisions that were made to take this person's life, and that it is administered, once again, I sound like a broken record, just that it's administered completely fairly across the board. Then if the person is truly guilty and there's no question of their guilt, if this is the punishment, then this is the punishment, you know. And that's it. I'll talk to you later. Bye.